Yeah, we did our best. Hopefully it'll work out okay. Okay, so I should say, for those of you who are totally new, this Bible study on Tuesday night at Tokyo Baptist Church has been meeting for probably more than 15 years, almost every Tuesday night for a long time. And what we always do here is we pick one book of the Bible, the class picks it, and then we study it verse by verse for however long that takes. We've read a lot of the books in the Bible, but not all of them so far. And tonight, presently, we're studying the Old Testament book of Leviticus. So as you can see from this first slide, we're in chapter 7 of Leviticus. Last week we'd finished the first 10 verses of chapter 7, and tonight we will finish chapter 7. Sometimes when you're reading a book, not a novel, but a textbook or some other kind of book, it helps to read the ending before you read the beginning. And so this is one of those cases. I thought tonight our reading is from verse 11 to verse 38, but I want to begin by looking ahead to the ending and just read the last two verses of chapter 7, which are the last two verses of our reading this week. Steve, could you read that, please?
Okay. This is the law of the burnt offering, of the grain offering, of the sin offering, of the guilt offering, of the ordination offering, and of the peace offering, which the Lord commanded Moses on Mount Sinai, on the day that he commanded the people of Israel to bring their offerings to the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai.
Okay, so those are the last two verses of tonight's reading. And as you can see, it begins by saying, this is the law of the burnt offering and so forth. So, in case it's not obvious to everyone, let me ask, and somebody please help me by answering, what is this? This is the law of the burnt offering and so forth and so on, what Steve just read. This is referring to, what is it referring to? Anybody?
The summary position of the laws that were separately explained earlier.
Okay, so it seems to be looking backwards. When it says this is, it's summarizing something that's already been written. How far back do you think it's looking when it says this is the law of the burnt offering and so forth? Is it summarizing what?
Well, it summarizes the different aspect of how you approach God with the...
Yeah, my question is simpler than that. How many chapters do you think it's looking back to?
7 chapters of Leviticus.
Okay, so my question is, he says this is, and he describes it, and we understand he's looking backwards, and the question is, how far back is he looking? And one possible answer is, he's summarizing the whole first 7 chapters. Because as we've clearly seen in this class, the whole first 7 chapters do indeed have to do with offerings, right? And so that's a true answer. And I think that the author and editor arranged it so that those 2 verses could look all the way back to verse 1 of chapter 1. But probably the summary is not looking back quite so far. At least primarily, I think, it's summarizing everything between chapter 6, verse 8, and the end of chapter 7. What we call the additional instructions. Okay. So I think the entire chunk of text between chapter 6, verse 8, and the end of chapter 7 is one thing. And that's why I tried last week. I said I'd love to be able to read it all together, but we sort of ran out of time in the middle. And so tonight we're finishing the second part of that that group of text that's called the additional instructions. And let me just show you why I think that last chunk of text hangs together primarily. First thing that I notice is that this phrase, this is the law of burnt offerings and so forth and so on, the expression, this is the law of, is an expression, the one that's underlined on the slide, is an expression that we see for the first time here in this section of text. Actually, for the first time we see this expression is in verse 8 of chapter 6. We never saw him say before verse 8 of chapter 6, this is the law of, and they do. So this, what I'm saying, is one giant block of text beginning in verse 8 of chapter 6 reads this way. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the burnt offerings. And then that's how this section of text begins. And then this expression, this is the law, this is the law, this is the law, is repeated frequently in the text that follows. In fact, I count 6 times that it's repeated, including the one time in the summary verse that Steve read it at the first. One for each of the 5 types of offering. It says, this is the law of whole offerings, of burnt offerings. This is the law of grain. This is the law of sin. This is the law of guilt. This is the law of peace. And then the summary verses at the end that say, this is the law of, and then he repeats the summary over again. And so it appears that, and I don't know how significant this all may be, but it appears that we're dealing with one block of text, which I outlined as calling the additional instructions regarding the offerings here.
Question.
Yeah.
So these texts where it says that this is the law, was this a part that could have been repeated orally, as a group, or, when they go back and try to remember the laws and its purposes, so it's stated this way so it can be memorized and orally stated, to their various groups?
I'm not entirely sure, but what I can observe is that this group of text, which I'll say in a minute, which is being addressed now to priests rather than to the people generally, is being systematically treated in this way. And each of these offerings is now being classified as a law, or a commandment of God. This is the law, this is the law, this is the law. And the one other thing that I notice is that in the summary that we began by reading, that Steve read, the order in which the laws are summarized is the same as the order in which they appear in this final block of text. You may remember when we started the chapter, it began with burnt offerings, grain offerings, then peace offerings, then sin offerings, guilt offerings. But in the last segment of text addressed to the priest, the peace offerings are last, and in the summary at the end of the whole section of 7 chapters, the peace offerings are also listed last.
Well,
Yeah.
this is more like what I found about the Leviticus. To me, that each offering seems like seems more like the interdependent. The intersecting with each other. Each offering is not entirely independent of for example, grain offering it's not like grain offering separate from the sin offering or guilt offering or peace offerings. So.
If what you're saying is that this text is intricately and carefully structured, and there's a lot of interrelationship between the parts, you must be right. And I'm pointing out just one element of that as we get going into this lesson. We've had 7 chapters of text regarding offerings. All 5 types of offerings were treated once, and then there was some additional instructions regarding all of them, which we started studying last week and we're concluding tonight. And really the only point I'm strongly making is that this last section that we finished tonight is something unto itself. It sort of holds together uniquely. You may also remember that in the first time that we studied grain offerings in chapter 2, no mention was made about offerings that would be offered when the priests were ordained. But the second time through, last week's study, the grain offering description was extended a bit to talk about how you would handle the grain offerings that were made when Aaron and his sons were ordained priests in Israel. And so that additional type of offering was inserted the second time through the discussion of these offerings. And I'll also observe that in the concluding verses that Steve read, the last two verses of chapter 7, the ordination offerings are mentioned again. They're summarized again. And so this whole text is sort of moving towards the priests. It began by focusing on the offerings themselves and on the people. If someone sins, if someone is guilty, what offering would be brought? And then in the section that we're in now, the point of view is shifting, as I noted last week, and it's looking at the same offerings more from the side of the priests, or more at least in terms of what the priests have to do, what the priests do with the offerings that the people bring. In the first chapter 1 through verse 7 of chapter 6, it's Moses talking to the people. God says to Moses, tell the people. In the second block of it, God says to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons, right? It's instructions of God going to the priests. And this difference in formula that you were talking about before, this is the law, shows up in exactly the same time that the speech of God shifts to being directed more to the priests and less to the people, which I can't explain the full significance of, but it's not pure coincidence. It's the text. The text is addressing these matters from a slightly different point of view. All right. So, and then just looking ahead to next week and future weeks, you won't be surprised that the next thing that we come to in chapters 8, 9, and 10 is priests. Right? So the text is moving from offerings towards priests. Sort of that's one direction we see in this. So that's just a kind of a introduction regarding the structure of the text. Tonight, the reading that we're going to do then is about peace offerings. We've already covered the first 10 verses of chapter 7, where the author has revisited burnt offerings, grain offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings, and finally he's going to be revisiting peace offerings starting in verse 11 of chapter 7. So now the hard work begins. Steve, if you could read chapter 7, verses 11 through 18, please.
And this is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings that one may offer to the Lord. If he offers it for a thanksgiving, then he shall offer with the thanksgiving sacrifice unleavened loaves mixed with oil, unleavened wafers smeared with oil, and loaves of fine flour well mixed with oil. With the sacrifice of his peace offerings for thanksgiving, he shall bring his offering with loaves of leavened bread. And from it he shall offer one loaf from each offering as a gift to the Lord. It shall belong to the priest who throws the blood of the peace offerings, and the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offerings for thanksgiving shall be eaten on the day of his offering. He shall not leave any of it until the morning. But if the sacrifice of his offering is a vow offering or a free will offering, it shall be eaten on the day that he offers his sacrifice, and on the next day what remains of it shall be eaten. But what remains of the flesh of the sacrifice on the third day shall be burned up with fire. If any of the flesh of sacrifice of his peace offering is eaten on the third day, he who offers it shall not be accepted, neither shall it be credited to him. It is tainted, and he who eats of it shall bear his iniquity.
Right, so let me try to slow down, and for tonight's reading, we'll go through more carefully. At the beginning of this reading, verse 11 of chapter 7 starts out, and this is the law of. And that's, by way of introduction, I was pointing out that we're near the end of a section of text which has repeated this formula now already 4 times. This will be the 5th time that we hear the expression, and this is the law of. The first 4 times it was said, it was about other types of sacrifices. In this section, for some reason, the so-called peace offerings come last rather than third. And people wonder why it is that the order is changed this time as the word is going through the priests from God through Moses to the priests. Do you have any idea why the order would have changed to place the peace offerings last? As I mentioned before, when you expect order in text like this and suddenly the order that you're expecting is broken, it's worthwhile at least to stop and ask yourself if that's significant. Everybody who's read Leviticus just about has noticed that the 5 types of offerings, or 6 if you include ordination the second time through, have this ordering difference, and people have talked for centuries about why it may be. Do you have any theory?
それがどうしてそういうことがこの順番になったのか。
Some people say it's most important. Some people say, and this is, I think, the best answer is because it would be actually practically and theologically the last one to be performed. The first block of text where it went through burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, they were just describing what the offering was like. How did you prepare it? What animal did you use, and so forth. But in actual practice, we can tell from our reading here that the burnt offerings and grain offerings will happen every day in the temple, and the peace offerings are actually physically placed on top of the burnt offerings, which are laid onto the fire first. And so, as a practical matter, the peace offerings, which are the parts of the fatty portions, which are placed, by the people who are going to eat a part of the meat that remains, these offerings would actually be placed last. Is one thing, and then sort of theologically they're last, because you have to take care of your sin and you have to take care of your guilt before it's time to think about other kinds of offerings, which are measures of your thanksgiving and fellowship with God. And so the guilt offerings and the sin offerings help people restore their relationship with God. This last type of offering, the so-called peace offering or fellowship offering, is a picture of an intact relationship with God. And so these are some of the things people think of when they notice that Moses and the Holy Spirit have actually decided to give peace offerings last place, and in some sense the most important place, final place, in the discussion of offerings that we're doing now. The Hebrew peace offering, the English text that we're studying here, the ESV text translates as Hebrew peace offering, peace offering, peace offering. You may remember when we studied chapter 3, I said that it's not that easy to translate the Hebrew into English. Some people translate it peace offering, some people translate it offering of well-being, some people translate it as a shared or fellowship offering. Literally, if you look and translate it, the same Hebrew that's used to describe the burnt offering is part of the word here. This is also a burnt offering, but it's a burnt offering where part of the animal is also eaten, right? The fellowship offering is one where a particular portion of the animal is burned to make a pleasing aroma to God, and the remainder of the animal is eaten by the one who's bringing the offering. And so what this offering implies is a sacral meal, a fellowship meal. I think, Rick, you or somebody said it sort of reminded you of the Lord's Supper. This is a fellowship activity where, in a sense, the people and the priests and God are all involved in this one. And that may explain why it sort of comes last. After sin and guilt and everything has been taken care of, then the peace, the well-being, the fellowship offering would come. throughout the Bible, and you have to kind of go throughout the Bible to get a fuller sense of what this means, to see what was actually happening in the biblical narrative when people made these offerings. I can give you some examples. We don't have time for a lot. But if you look in 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 15, first person that finds it, let me know. 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 15, unless I made a mistake. 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 15. And so here, I'll read this one in English. So it says, 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 15. So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they sacrificed peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. And so here's an example of a time, at least they thought so at the moment, of a joyous occasion, the coronation of the first king in Israel. And one of the things that they did was that they made a peace offering, such as we're talking about now in the Old Testament book of Leviticus. But it's important to notice also that these kind of offerings are not always made in joyous occasions. They're sometimes made in times of great distress. And so to take an example of when a peace offering is made in times of distress, look at Judges 20:26. Judges 20:26. It's Judges is it's a book before Samuel, before Samuel. Why didn't I say so? Shishiki. Hi.
What chapter? Judges? Chapter what?
Chapter 20, verse 26.
20 and
Verse 26.
26。四式の20章の26節です。
Probably to make my point, I'm offering this as an example of a time when an offering of this type is made, when it's not just a happy time, but it's a stressful time. Let me start at verse 24. So Judges 20:24 says, So the people of Israel came near against the people of Benjamin the second day, and Benjamin went against them out of Gibeah the second day and destroyed 18,000 men of the people of Israel. All these were men who drew the sword. And then all the people of Israel, the whole army, went up and came to Bethel and wept. Okay, they're crying because of what's happened. They sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. All right. And so I obviously don't have the scholarship skills or the time in a class like this to go throughout the Old Testament and search up all the times when people made peace offerings, but it's by looking at examples that you will see more fully what they're talking about in Leviticus. So we're talking about an offering that's offered at times when people are in distress or when people are happy. They want to eat meat. They're going to have a meal where they're going to eat the meat, but they want to dedicate the feast that follows to the Lord, and they offer a fellowship offering, shared offering, peace offering, however you want to call it. The distinctive feature of this offering is the fatty portions are offered up to the Lord. The rest of the meat is eaten by the people, right? And so it's the type of offering that the people actually participate in eating. Okay, right? And so the other thing you want to notice go back. We've got to get back to Leviticus again. Back where we are. Okay, Leviticus chapter 7, verse 12. Verse 11 says, And this is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings that one may offer to the Lord. This is a voluntary offering. It's not the same as a sin offering or a guilt offering or certain kinds of grain offerings that are required in certain circumstances. This type of offering that we're talking about is one that people may offer if they want to. And since it's an offering you may make, then your reason for making it can be your own reason. one of the major categories as you read throughout the Bible why people do make these kinds of offerings is thanksgiving. All right, and so verse 12 gives that example, if he offers it for thanksgiving. And I don't know if this is true, but I'm guessing if we went throughout the Bible, we would find the frequency of reasons why people make fellowship offerings is usually a thanksgiving. You could say it's a thanksgiving kind of a thing. Not always, as I've shown, but usually. I won't go in the interest of time, but if you're interested, you can make a note to yourself. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 26 is one passage that describes the peace offering as a thanks offering. Some of the Psalms even are inscribed as psalms to be sung when giving thanks. The main example is Psalm 100 because the actual inscription of the psalm says this is a psalm to be used when giving thanks offerings. So thanksgiving is a fair description of a lot of the times that this type of offering is made throughout the Bible. And when it does, we're told here in Leviticus, verse 12 says, if it's offered for thanksgiving, then, along with the meat offering itself, the thanksgiving offering, there's supposed to also be a grain offering, like we've read about before. I'm not certain why this is. I'm not sure if anybody knows for sure why it is, but it is one of the instructions that if you're going to offer a peace offering and your reason is to give thanks to God, then in addition to the meat that's involved, there's also going to be an offering of grain. And not just a boring one. It says here that there's supposed to be several types of unleavened loaves mixed with oil, unleavened wafers smeared with oil, loaves of fine flour well mixed with oil. There's a lot of bread stuffs being offered at the same time in conjunction with this. Right? And certainly one of the things that's going on here is it's providing a variety of food for the priests. Right? This section is sort of from the priest's point of view, and if there's one theme that's being emphasized throughout, it's that a portion of the offerings of the people go to the priests. It's how they eat here. So most of that unleavened bread would go to the priest, even if some of it's made as a memorial offering to God, as we've seen before. But then something really interesting happens is that in addition to the meat and the unleavened bread, it says, with the sacrifice of his peace offerings for thanksgiving, he shall bring his offering with loaves of leavened bread, right? So now leaven is coming in. And one thing we know for sure from what we've studied in this class is a loaf of leavened bread is not a grain offering to God, right? Leaven is the one thing you can never offer to God. And so the bread is absolutely destined for the priest to eat, right? The priests want to have leavened bread too. And so these guys are thankful, usually, or some other reason they want to have a sacral meal. They want to bring the animal in and have the priests throw the blood on the sides of the altar and offer up the fat portions as a pleasing aroma to God. They want to go off and have a picnic, a barbecue with their family or friends or whatever. And the rule for that is if you're having a Thanksgiving dinner, then have a Thanksgiving dinner with unleavened bread and leavened bread and all of that, and that's all going to the priests. Because it's not destroyed in any other way. All right, and so verse 14 says, and from it he shall offer one loaf from each offering as a gift to the Lord. I've seen this translated two ways. The way I was reading it, first of all, is I thought that for every animal that you offered, you have to offer one loaf of leavened bread. That's how it came into my mind the first time. After looking at other translations and commentaries, I think I might have been wrong. It may be the way you're supposed to understand this is that for every peace offering that he makes, he's supposed to offer one loaf of all of the different kinds of bread that have just been mentioned. Leavened bread and this kind of unleavened bread and that kind of unleavened bread. And I don't know if I can fully untangle that. The two key points here to me are that in addition to the offering you want to make, the law is requiring you to bring bread as well for the priest. And that a portion of it's going to go to the priest who performs the sacrifice for you. right? It says, and from it he shall offer one loaf, this is verse 14, as an offering, as a gift to the Lord. It shall belong to the priest who throws the blood of the peace offering. So in order to do a fellowship offering, you need a priest to take the blood of the animal and throw it on the altar. That guy's doing his job as a priest to tend to the sacrifice, and he's entitled to, so far we read, he's entitled to all of this bread that you're enjoined to bring in addition to the animal, the flesh that you're going to eat. Right? Now the next thing that we get here in verse 15 is the idea that the flesh that's left over now, remember in this offering just a little part of the fatty organs of the animal is burned up. The blood is thrown on the sides of the altar, but all the rest of the meat you normally eat is left over. And for this type of offering, that meat belongs to the person making the offering to have a feast. But there's a restriction, and it says here, if the sacrifice is a thanksgiving offering, then the meat has to be eaten on the day of the offering. And this is important enough that they're even more specific about what they mean. They say, you can't leave any of that meat until after sunrise that follows. So you do your offering, you have the meat back, you prepare the meal. You have to make sure that everybody eats up all the meat before sunrise. And in case of this one, there's no provision for leftovers. This is a hard commandment. You got to eat it up, right? And what I'm thinking is, this kind of makes sense because it's a Thanksgiving offering in the community in Israel. The only reason why you would have leftover meat is because you can't find somebody that wants to share it with you. And there's no shortage of people to share this with you, right? You're in the middle of a bunch of Israeli people who are probably happy to come eat your meat if you want to invite them over. And so there's no problem with this command. First of all, you wouldn't do such an offering if it weren't in a context where you were confident you could eat all of the meat before the following day. And second of all, if you were nervous about that, you could just invite more people to your Thanksgiving meal. There's really no problem with the imagery here. However, a person might have other reasons to make a peace offering, and two of the examples given here are a vow offering, verse 16, or a free will offering. And we can't be 100% sure what's meant, but a vow offering, it's thought, is somebody wants to have a meal to commemorate making a promise or a vow or a pledge or having completed a promise or a vow or a pledge, something that Israelites are not supposed to do casually. You're not, since everything depends on God and not on you. Israelites were slow to make vows, actually, but if you were going to make one, you could. And you could commemorate the vow with a meal like this, or a free will offering would mean you have some other reason, just by your own reason, that you want to do this. And so my way of sort of guessing at the one thing is sure is that if your reason is not Thanksgiving but something else, like a vow offering or just some other reason that you have a little bit of extra time to consume the meat. It doesn't have to be consumed before sunup following. It has to be consumed before the end of the day that begins with sunup following. Before the third day you've got to finish it, or it's imagined here that there would be cases where you couldn't find enough people to help you eat up the meat, and so they make provisions in case of this one for disposing of the meat that's left over. Verse 17 says, what remains of the flesh of this sacrifice on the third day shall be burned up with fire. So you can't keep this meat longer than that, and I think that the reason for this is pretty clear, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about a time many centuries before refrigeration and a climate that's not very kind to meat. And so you've taken an animal and sacrificed it in the way described in chapter 3. It's a peace offering for one of these reasons. You've got a short time or a little bit longer time, depending on your reason for bringing the offering. But one of the things you don't want is an animal that's been devoted to this fellowship offering with God becoming rotten, becoming adulterated by bacteria, going bad. Right? You don't want that to happen. And so that's why they provide for it to be burned up and disposed of properly if any of the meat and the meat is left over.
This makes sense with now when we think about Jesus' parable when he spoke about the king with having a celebration, but the key people that wanted to come didn't come. He says, go out into the street and bring all those other people, into the celebration. Like let's not make this event go to waste. And so I can see that correlation with what's happening with this sacrifice here.
Yeah, I mean, I read that especially with respect to the so-called Thanksgiving offering, where they don't even imagine the possibility that there would be any left over, right? Because let's say you're a rich guy and you sacrifice a whole bull, you got 1,000 pounds of meat on your hands, but still you've got hundreds of thousands, even millions of people in Israel who can eat, right? And so it shouldn't be difficult to share out that food with people. But evidently they could also imagine more private ceremonies where you wouldn't be planning a big event, but by some reason you'd sacrifice a ram or a goat or something, and it was too much food for the people who attended, and so you just wouldn't want to let it go bad. And this then rolls over logically into the next section about unclean things. So, Steve, could you read 19 through 21, please?
19 through 21. Flesh that touches any unclean thing shall not be eaten. It shall be burned up with fire. And all who are clean may eat flesh. But the person who eats of the flesh of the sacrifice of the Lord's peace offerings, while an uncleanness is on him, that person shall be cut off from his people. And if anyone touches an unclean thing, whether human uncleanness or an unclean beast or any unclean detestable creature, and then eats some flesh from the sacrifice of the Lord's peace offerings, that person shall be cut off from his people.
This is a remarkable thing. So just before we've read that the people who would eat meat from a peace offering had to be careful. If it was for Thanksgiving, they had to finish by morning so that there was none of it left. If it was one where they had a little bit of extra time, like an extra day to eat it, then maybe they could get it eaten. But if not, they had to prevent contamination by burning up the part that was left over before the third day. And this logically leads to consideration of, and even proves that the issue about the aging of the meat is one of contamination, right? It's the same subject in different form. And certainly we can understand that contaminated meat should not be eaten, all right? That's what it says in verse 19. Verse 20 says that a person who eats the flesh of the sacrifice of the Lord's peace offering while uncleanness is on him, if the source of uncleanness is the person who's eating, right, that's a slightly different case, then that person shall be cut off from his people. Cut off from his people means, at best, being put outside of the nation of Israel, more likely being put to death. This is a very extreme penalty, for someone who knows that they're unclean and nevertheless proceeds to eat the meat of an animal that's been sacrificed in according with these rules about sacrifices to God. I think there's some hope for these people. Remember, previously we studied in chapter 5, verse 2, that if you unknowingly were unclean, then there was a way to atone for your sin. I think there will clearly be cases where people accidentally commit this infraction, and there are ways to atone for sin in Israel. But you can't really take the sting out of it completely, because it's saying that if you are unclean and you eat meat from an animal that's been sacrificed as a peace offering to God, very serious consequences are awaiting you. And the whole subject of clean and unclean and how do you make something that's unclean, clean, and so forth is a future section of Leviticus we'll be studying later. We're just touching on it briefly here. We'll talk about it a lot later. But just to sort of, if you didn't know at all what they were talking about, there's a lot of animals, for example, that are considered to be unclean, and coming in contact with an unclean animal would make a person ceremonially unclean. It's not a sin. It just disqualifies you from participating in the meal like this until you become clean again. Likewise, and this is a main problem for priests, any contact with a dead body would render a person unclean. And so, for example, the priests were instructed never to touch a dead body, no matter who it was, unless it was your mother or your father or your wife, or your virgin sister or something. I mean, there are very few cases where priests were allowed to get involved in funeral ceremonies because it would render them unclean and they couldn't participate in offering sacrifices and so forth. So they have a lot of rules in that time about what can make a person temporarily unclean. And the main thing is you just realize that you're unclean and you follow the rules for becoming clean again. And in the meantime, you don't participate in a fellowship meal where somebody's offering meat that's been sacrificed to God. If you do, the penalty seems to be very severe. Okay. And I'd ask you to just ponder, what is the theological significance of this, that the penalty for eating this meat is so severe? From our Christian point of view in the 21st century, looking back, it seems really severe, right? That you might actually be put to death or excommunicated from your brothers and sisters in Israel because you were unclean and you ate a meal like this. What does that tell us is a really interesting question.
Well, as a custom, hopefully, that in most cases, that when people would pray before their meals, is to just take pause and bring the Lord into whatever you're going to eat, your dinner or your breakfast, and in that sense, you enjoy the presence of God. So I would think that if God says this is holy, and then you just come in sort of just casually, your heart isn't right, and you therefore and God sees all things. God sees the heart, and so obviously the prophets, the Levites would take notice of that pretty quick, that something's not right, and to spot that. But so that's what I think is that if it's all set up for the holiness and the presence of God, God calls it holy. And you're not going in there holy with heart, mind, and soul. Then it's a miss. I think.
Yeah. I think we'll want to keep pondering this as we go forward in this study to the other parts that have to do with ritual cleanliness, because at the very least, it's telling us that there's a radical separation between God and man that's serious. It's real. It's not just symbolic. It's not just a teaching moment. There's an actual separation between a perfect, sinless, holy God and sinful man. And the grace that's being extended to these people to allow there to be ways to reconcile with God through all that we're reading in Leviticus. And later, when Christ will come, the grace that's being offered to us in Christ to be reconciled with God is not something that you should fool around with or take it lightly. It's like the unforgivable sin in the New Testament, right? Every sin can be forgiven but one. It says in the New Testament. We wonder what is that unforgivable sin, and I think it's something like people who reject Christ because they understand who He is. They hate Jesus because He's the Son of God and He forgives sin. And if you rejected Him, there's no bridge across. You're lost then, because you've cut off the one bridge that there is to salvation. This is the one bridge that there is to salvation before Christ came, right? The Jews have a way to remain reconciled in a fellowship with God. And it is for them what Jesus is for us, and they, for their own benefit, need to understand that they can't take it lightly, right? You don't knowingly go in and trample on the holy things that God is holding out to you, and if you do, the worst possible consequences can follow. And we'll see that as we start studying the ordination of priests. You'll see two of Aaron's sons are killed because they got frivolous with how they did their ministry before the Lord, right? So the Old Testament anyway is helping us to understand that this is serious business, sin and reconciliation from sin. But that's a kind of a crude answer. I haven't given it a lot of thought. Steve, might you read another one for me, please?
22 through 27?
Yeah.
Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, You shall eat no fat of ox or sheep or goat, the fat of an animal that dies of itself, and the fat of one that is torn by beasts may be put to any other use, but on no account shall you eat it. For every person who eats of the fat of an animal of which a food offering may be made to the Lord shall be cut off from his people. Moreover, you shall eat no blood whatever, whether of fowl or of animal or of your dwelling places. Whoever eats any blood, that person shall be cut off from his people.
Okay, so this is a picture of blood, sausage, and fat, animal fat. People eat this stuff, right? And I think to keep this in perspective, we are talking about now the one offering where an animal goes in up to the tent and is sacrificed. The blood is offered and part of the animal is offered, but most of the animal comes away from the temple, goes back to people's homes, and is eaten by the people. And so they're given this ability to have fellowship with God and to make offerings to God. And it's a great gift, but it's also a great responsibility and a great danger. So we just saw one of the cases where if you're not careful and you're not really entitled to participate in a holy meal because of something that you know about, you should stay away until the time is right. Otherwise, it could be a very serious consequence. This is similar in kind to that. It's saying the animal is coming, the fat portions are being sacrificed to God, the blood is being thrown on the side of the walls of the altar. But if you look now on what Steve just read, in verse 22, this is another fresh speech of God. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, and notice now that he's speaking to the people again and not to the priests. So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying. This is the way usually God addresses Moses and the people. When he addresses the priests directly, it's an exception. Now he's back to the usual way of saying, this message is going out to all the people, of course, including the priests. You shall eat no fat of ox or sheep or goats. Now this is basically repeating what we already read in chapter 3. And there's clearly then a strong connection between the peace offerings and in this prohibition against eating fat. In chapter 3, the two things were spoken of together. Here again in chapter 7, the two things are being spoken of together. And I think that the connection is pretty clear because in this offering, the only part of the animal that's offered is the fat. Actually, to be precise, it's the kidneys and the liver and the intestinal fat, connected with it. That was described in detail elsewhere, but everybody understands now we're talking about those parts that are offered to God. And what it's saying here is those parts belong to God. Okay? Specifically, you're not supposed to eat fat, not just in general, but you're not supposed to eat fat of oxen or sheep or goats, because those are the three kinds of animals that you can make an offering to God with. And if you use one of those kind of animals and you make an offering to God that's a peace offering, well, your offering is the fat portions, right? And so if you were to eat the fat portions of an ox or of a sheep or of a goat, you would be in effect eating that which belongs to God. Okay? And that's not allowed. Right? They could eat, by the way, the fat portions of other clean animals that weren't used for sacrificing to God. I don't know what those would be, but there clearly would be some. There's other animals that are clean and that they may eat that have fat portions, and that's not in view here. I think. What's in view here is the portions that could be gifts to God.
これはもう神様に捧げるその
An animal that's not one of those, some other kind of animal that dies, we read in verse 24, or is torn apart by beasts or dies by disease or whatever. Even a non-offering class of animal that dies in that way can't be eaten because it's unclean. It becomes unclean by being dead.
それはもう
If an animal dies before it's butchered, it's unclean and therefore not available for them to eat. All right, but it says here that they could use it; they just can't eat it. Right, so it said you could use it for other purposes, and there's lots of things you can use animal fat for besides eating, but you wouldn't eat it because it was unclean. And then again the strong prohibition, verse 25: every person who eats of the fat of an animal of which a food offering may be made to the Lord shall be cut off from his people. So whatever is qualified to be used as a peace offering to God is disqualified to be used as food for people. That's the point. Because that puts you at risk of sort of stealing an offering away from God, or stealing for a profane purpose something which has been made holy. And the prohibition is strengthened when it comes to blood. There's no exceptions in the case of blood. Moreover, you shall eat no blood, whatever, whether from birds or animals in any of your dwelling places. Whoever eats any blood, that person shall be cut off from the people. This is a rule that runs all the way through the Bible, because the Hebrews understood the life is in the blood, and it's not a human thing to be eating life. You can't eat life. You can't eat animal flesh until the life is gone from it. When it's been butchered properly and the blood is gone, then it's not an animal anymore, it's food. But if you eat it while it's still got blood in it, then that's prohibited. I'm personally curious to know whether an ox or a sheep or a goat that was with blemish, could be eaten, because that's disqualified as being an offering to the Lord, right? That you had to offer perfect animals to God. So if you had imperfect animals, I don't know whether they would be, available to human beings to eat the fat or not. But those are the kinds of things that the rabbis debated endlessly, right? And there'd be different schools of thought, different rabbinic schools where they disagree on this or that point, because it's that kind of a thing, right? Different people will read this and on the details might wonder how you apply it. Yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah.
About verses 19.
Yeah.
The first part, the flesh that touched the alien thing.
Yeah.
So what's that flesh? Flesh is
Meat, animal meat.
animal meat.
Yeah.
No.
No, so it's talking about the meat that you would eat. So
How can those meat touch unclean?
that's one way. Or somebody who's a leper or who has touched a dead body, like you go prepare the dead body of your mother and then you come in and you cook dinner. So it's any kind of unclean. It says any unclean thing, whether human uncleanness or an unclean beast. If you don't wash your hands after you go to the toilet or whatever it is, there's lots of ways that you could become unclean. From a modern scientific point of view, or from a Hebrew, ritual cleanliness point of view, and they didn't have modern science then. Instead of them, it's like one thing, right? Their idea of bacteria is not the same as ours, and it might not even just be a microbiology problem. Maybe some other kind of problem as well. But they understood clearly some things were clean and some things are unclean. It's not a sin to be unclean. Everybody becomes unclean sometimes. But when you're unclean, you have to refrain from doing holy things until you become clean again. And in the future chapters, we'll see how do you become clean again. Let me push, Steve. Let's finish.
28 and 29?
Yeah.
Because we've read everything else, I guess. Okay.
28 through 36.
Okay, 28 through 36, very well.
28節から36です。
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, Whoever offers the sacrifice of his peace offerings to the Lord shall bring his offering to the Lord from the sacrifice of his peace offerings. His own hand shall bring the Lord's food offering. He shall bring the fat with the with the breast, that the breast may be waved as a wave offering before the Lord. The priest shall burn the fat on the altar, but the breast shall be for Aaron and his sons. And the right thigh you shall give to the priest as a contribution from the sacrifice of your peace offerings. Whoever among the sons of Aaron offers the blood of the peace offering, and the fat shall have the right thigh for a portion. For the breast that is waved and the thigh that is contributed, I have taken from the people of Israel out of the sacrifices of their peace offerings, and have given them to Aaron the priest and to his sons as a perpetual due from the people of Israel. This is the portion of Aaron and of his sons from the Lord's food offerings, from the day they were presented to serve as priests of the Lord. The Lord commanded this to be given them by the people of Israel from the day that he anointed them. It is a perpetual due throughout their generations.
Okay, thanks. That's good. All right, so I'm mindful of the fact we're out of time, but let me quickly go through this. So verse 28, we have again fresh speech from God. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, and again, as is typically the case, the Lord is telling Moses to speak to the people of Israel. And what he's telling him to say to the people of Israel is that whenever they bring their peace offerings to the Lord, as we've been discussing, then they're going to they bring the animal to the tent of meeting. They kill the animal. We've studied this before. The priest takes the blood and goes and offers the blood. The animal then is butchered by the person who's making the offering. And what it's saying here is that the person who's bringing the offering by their own hands needs to take the fat portions that will be burnt as an offering to the Lord and the meat, which is going to be given to the priest. In this case, it says the breast. It says, he shall bring the fat with the breast. This is verse 30. He shall bring the fat with the breast, that the breast may be waved as a wave offering before the Lord. On this chart, the breast would be what's called the brisket. This is the part of the cow that they would butcher. And so this brisket, one of the tastier parts of the cow, and the part of the fat and intestinal organs is going to be sacrificed as a burnt offering to God, are brought by the offerer themselves to the priest. And then the priests keep the brisket as part of their food, and they make the offering of the parts that are to be offered, and they throw the blood on the side of the altar. People can't make this kind of offering alone. This is a key point. This is a system that depends on the priests helping them to make their offering. They can't throw blood on the altar. They can't offer to burn things on the altar. There's no do-it-yourself system for sacrificing in Israel. So to get it done, they have to go to the tabernacle, and they need the priest to help them. The priest burns the fat, the priest throws out the blood, and then the breast meat is for the priests. In addition to that, the breast meat or brisket, which is divvied up, I guess, among Aaron and his sons, says, the right thigh, this is verse 32, you shall give to the priest as a contribution. Whoever among the sons of Aaron offers the blood of the peace offerings and the fat shall have the right thigh for their portion. We can't be sure, but the rabbi's tradition says that it's the middle part of the back leg, and it's the right leg. So this cow is facing this way. It's the leg on the other side of the cow. It would be what it says on there, the thick flank. There's a part of the cow that you give to the priest who actually helped you to do the offering. In addition to the brisket, which goes to maintain the priesthood generally. And so then you'll see it goes here and reiterates a lot. It's making this point sort of a lot. The breast is waved and the thigh is contributed. I have taken from the people, God says, out of the sacrifices of their peace offering and given them to Aaron and the priest and to his sons as a perpetual due from the people of Israel. Verse 34. Verse 35, this is the portion of Aaron and of his sons from the Lord's food offerings from the day they were presented to serve as priests to the Lord. Verse 35. Verse 36, the Lord commanded this to be given to them by the people in Israel from the day that he anointed them, and is a perpetual due throughout their generations. It's astonishing to me. They basically said the same thing in emphatic language 3 or 4 times. And so obviously a point is being made here. And this is a point that we read in the Bible going all the way back, to the thought that the house of Levi has no real estate in the promised land. Rather, they're going to be sustained through the offerings of the other tribes of Israel. That principle is reinforced here. And so the priests are going to be fed by their share that God has apportioned to them of these offerings. And please notice that unlike sin offerings and guilt offerings or even grain offerings where the priests had to eat it inside the holy place, and it could only be the priests, presumably this meat just belongs to the priests. This must be how they feed their families also. And so this meat is their due. This is their part that God gives them. It's their share. It's their proportion of the wealth of Israel, and the priests have. And so, in conclusion, we open with a conclusion, but this then, we conclude now in 7 chapters of Leviticus is the law of the burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering, the ordination offering, and the peace offering, which the Lord commanded to Moses while the tabernacle was at Sinai. And we understand then what these offerings were. And again I say, this is not because as Christians we have to do any of these things. But the reason why we may benefit from reading these things is the problem that we have with sin and guilt is the same problem that they had. The way that we have to deal with sin and guilt is Christ Jesus. But one of the ways we can understand him better is by understanding how his ancestors, people of Israel in the time of Moses, dealt with their sin and guilt through this offering system. And I think it helps us if we meditate on these things. Let's pray. And dear God, again, I'm sorry for running over time. I thank you that people could come here. I know that this material is difficult to teach, certainly difficult to understand. And yet I have a sense that you want us to read these things, Lord, and to understand them. And I pray that you will help us with that. Please take these words into our hearts and our minds and their work on us in ways that help us to appreciate more fully your character and our sinfulness and the wonderful blessing that we have in Christ, through whom our sins and our guilt can be taken away effectively and eternally. Please help everybody to get home safely tonight. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.